Hello, hello? No. Good evening and welcome to our today's evening event, which is the discussion Contested Memories, Dissonant Heritage, Material Totalitarian Legacy in Eastern Europe. The event takes place as a part of the Academy Exercising Modernity, which is a program for intellectual, academic, and also artistic and cultural exchange. And the idea of the exercising modernity is to describe, but also to contextualize Polish modernity. And we try to do it also by tracing and looking on transfers, migration of ideas, objects, memories, and also we try to look and to be like we try to trace the gaps and the incoherences and discrepancies, and also the moments when the big narratives just fall apart. And I'm sure that today's discussion and our dear panelists will also talk about these problems, and I will ask Aleksandra Janus to introduce our panelists.
Hello, good evening, everybody. It is my great pleasure and honor to be able to moderate this conversation with Małgorzata Jędrzejczyk. And our guests tonight are Karoline Gil, who is a deputy head of department dialogues and head of section at the IFA in Stuttgart, Germany. As a competence center for foreign cultural policy, the IFA connects civil societies, cultural practices, art, media, and science. She has long-standing experience in intercultural dialogue and the creation of multinational networks with a profound interest in international relations. Studying European relations and socio-economic transformation, she co-edited books on the Treaty on Good Relations and Neighborhood between Germany and Poland, on cross-border cooperation between both countries, and on regional European identities. And since 2009, she's an active member of the board of the Young DGAP, and since 2020, co-head of the DGAP in Baden-Württemberg. And also she worked as project manager for the Polish Institute in Leipzig, the Villa Decius in Krakow, and the Foundation for Polish-German Cooperation. Thank you for accepting our invitation. Our next guest tonight is Margaret Tali, who is a researcher, writer, editor, and organizer. And she's originally from Estonia, and for the past 10 years she has lived in the Netherlands. And her research expertise is related to contemporary and modern art, memory and trauma, and practices of curating and narrating cultural differences. And she has studied art history and cultural theory in Estonia, Germany, and Finland before going to the Netherlands for her doctoral studies. Recently, she has worked on the exhibition on difficult pasts that was also a topic of our workshop at the Exercising Modernity this morning. Our next guest is Kateryna Kobchenko, who has a PhD in history from Taras Shevchenko National University in Kyiv, Ukraine, and she's now a research associate at the University of Münster. And her research interests include the political and intellectual history of Ukraine in the European context in the 20th and 21st centuries, Ukrainian political emigration after the Second World War in the context of Cold War, women's history, oral history, and memory studies. And we also had the pleasure to have a seminar with Kateryna Kobchenko earlier today. And Jan Behrends, who is a senior researcher at the Leibniz Center for Contemporary History in Potsdam. And in his research, he is focusing on Stalinism, propaganda, public discourse, violence, and wars in the Soviet and post-Soviet space. And he's also regarded as a leading expert on the history of Soviet and Russian security services. He has published widely on history of modern dictatorship, and was involved in the establishment of Historians Without Borders, and many, many other things that you can learn about and read about in our booklets. So in this company, we will be discussing dissonant and difficult heritage, and I will hand it over now to Małgorzata Jędrzejczyk again to tell you a little bit about the levels between which we're gonna be structuring the discussion.
Yes, it will be really a little bit, because we don't take in advance what will be discussed particularly, but we will definitely refer to monuments and memorials, war memorials, as important part of the difficult or dissonant heritage, but we would also like to refer to kind of infrastructure of everyday life, of architecture, which could be also considered as kind of difficult or dissonant heritage.
And we are also, as you all well know, there are many terms circulating to describe these types of heritage. There is difficult heritage, dissonant heritage, contested heritage. There are different ways of expressing problems that we are facing sometimes when confronted with certain materials remains of the past. And we don't want this debate to be too academic. We don't want to go into what's the difference between this term and that term, but we are more interested in certain examples and practices related with these types of contested, dissonant, or difficult heritage. And what I think is what these types of heritage have in common is the fact that these types of heritage, this type of legacy, is often very, like, it's difficult because it doesn't allow communities to build positive self-identification on the basis of it. Rather, it poses certain problems, or it leads to creation of certain social divisions or conflicts. So we're interested in all that, but as Małgorzata has said, not only in monuments, but also in infrastructure of everyday life. And our first question will be a general question to all of you, and we would like to hear about what particular types of dissonant, difficult, or contested heritage in your area of interest or in the geographic area where you live and work can be treated as an example of such dissonant and contested heritage. And I will pose this question first to Margaret to ask about the particular types of heritage that can be treated as dissonant or difficult or contested in the Baltics or Estonian context. And I will pass the mic to you.
Thank you. So when I was thinking about this topic, then I had to think back to an example that I've analyzed earlier. It's particularly the unknown soldier figure in Tallinn that was taken down 2009. And caused a lot of emotions in public space, but also there were people coming from Russia creating some of these heightened emotions in public during these few days, and it was removed shortly before 9th of May, so the celebration of the victory of the Second World War. And at that time, I was of a different opinion compared to how I feel now about the government's decision to remove it, because it was done in the middle of the night, the whole area was closed, and of course this also fed that whole feeling of something important is happening, so a lot of youth were on the streets. And at the time, I definitely thought that this is like, the government overreacted, and this could have been done in so much more humane and kind of open way. But so recently we have had another removal which brought a lot of emotions to the fore, of a monument, of a tank monument in the border of Estonia and Russia. You might have come across it in the news. Together with this tank, the government decided to remove all the remaining memorials from the Soviet era or containing the Soviet symbolics. So we are not a country in war. Most of the monuments have been moved already in the 90s, but some of them remained. And I think it's also, well, the kind of argument used is this of security. There's no space to negotiate because the decision has already been taken, and kind of the most strongest reference point is this soldier monument that was removed and taken to a cemetery in the outskirts of Tallinn. So yeah, the tank has been removed in the meanwhile as well, and taken also from Narva to the Tallinn area Museum of War. So a very different context. It was also put on display the next day after it was brought in among all this row of different tanks. But there is no kind of the government says that we need to remove these monuments, but there's no plan of what happens with them, actually. And how are we to think of them? Where are we to put them? So it's also decided like on a very ad hoc basis. And well, where we are now, we've also come a long way since the 90s, because the language of monuments and commemorating has changed so much, with contemporary artists making sometimes quite subtle gestures and shifting the way that meaning is created, or turning things around, or projecting something on monuments to make them speak in different ways. So I think it's, well, speaking of the Estonian case, I think it's just a pity that that none of this is now kind of openly allowed. So it already becomes like a moment of resistance if you do something alternative around the monument.
The same question to you, Karoline. What is considered as to be contested heritage or difficult heritage in terms of, or in context of Germany? And do you see any change in this way of perceiving dissonant heritage because of the full-scale invasion of Russia in February 2022?
So these were many questions. May I start with another story? Because I just came back from a conference that was held in Mainz, and the train today was fully packed. So I had to go to the restaurant and sit next to two elder men. And then they started to look at me and ask me why I'm thinking so much. Because I took like notes for today's evening event, and then I decided to ask them. I will participate in this panel tonight about contested dissonant heritage, what they think about it, because they obviously were from the eastern part of Germany, and they were speaking before about their work. And first of all, they didn't understand the question at all, what you're talking about, so it's quite an interesting reaction. And then I explained it a little bit more, that it's about material heritage, buildings, monuments related to both totalitarian parts of our history. And the answer was quite simple, that one of these men answered, no, all the buildings should remain. I don't care about the history of the buildings, and they should be just used in a functional way. And then I ask again, do you need any explanation, perhaps? Do you need any QR codes or description about the past of this one special building? And I say, no, I don't care. So it was really interesting. This was just a story from just a random story that could reflect on nowadays state of remembering this difficult heritage. And well, you asked me about whole of Germany, I think it's very difficult to answer this question because there are so many layers in any of these cities. And I mean, we are in Berlin here, so I think it's the finest example. And I brought one example I was thinking a lot about in preparing this event. This was about Nuremberg. I mean, I'm based in Stuttgart, so it's 2 hours from my city. Nuremberg was the place where the Nazi party built the Nazi party rally Congress building, the so-called Reichsparteitagsgelände. And I think this is quite an interesting example what's going on now in remembering this contested and difficult heritage, because the one part of this area complex is used as a memorial space, as a documentary center, but on the other hand, it's used for events. And now the Nuremberg Philharmonic there was a huge debate about if the Nuremberg Philharmonic can use it as a new hall, because the Nuremberg Philharmonic Hall, the opera, is being renovated, or should be renovated from 2025. So there was a huge discussion about if an orchestra can actually use a former Nazi building this scale. And now, it's still an ongoing debate, but they moved there, and this could be one example we could speak later about the current state of discussion, remembering this difficult heritage.
Mm-hmm. I will refer to your answer, and I will ask the same question Jan Behrends, although I would maybe slightly change this question and ask, where do you see are the major difference between East and West Germany regarding this difficult heritage concept?
Thank you. I think that's also a tough question, because actually at 30 years after reunification, I don't really like the East-West divide that much anymore, because I think also East Germany is very different now from the coast to the south, from east to west. I don't think you can say that there's the one East Germany and there was never the one West Germany. You know, heritage is treated very differently in Bavaria than it is in the north. So I think this is also in Germany always a very regional phenomenon. But I was going to counter a little bit and talk about everyday life, the story that Ms. Gall just told about the East Germans, with a story from my student years from the 1990s. And I studied here in Berlin. And in the 1990s, so right after reunification, right after the end of socialism, we did a lot of bike tours, you know, through the surrounding areas of Berlin. And one of the phenomena relating to monuments was that I was often angry as a history student to see how many of the street names from from communism sort of like remained in East Germany. And nobody seemed to care. There are lots of Thielmann streets and streets of German-Soviet friendship and peace streets and I don't know, anything. Gagarin, I mean, Pushkin, you name it, right? I mean, so you have the whole Soviet colonization in the street names. But on the other hand, there was a very interesting phenomenon that during the East German time, people in the little villages surrounding Berlin could not have the traditional war memorials that were often put up for the War of 1870, sometimes going back to 1815, then of course First World War, and of course they couldn't build one for the Second World War. So these had to be taken down. They were usually in the front of the church, and often they had put a Soviet monument in the front of the church. And it turned out, when you looked at these villages, that somehow many of these had survived. They were not destroyed, but they were just in someone's barn or in the basement of the schoolhouse or somewhere hidden away in the church. And people started putting them up again in the 1990s. So they did matter to them, obviously, right? I mean, it was also their relatives in the First World War that had died. It was not that long ago, maybe. So all these war monuments, Prussian war monuments, were like coming back all over the place. Although I think these people who put them up were not necessarily German nationalists who embraced the war, but they saw it as part of the regional heritage that was taken away from them, and then they restored it on a very local level. And I thought it was very, very interesting that, you know, that there is something that obviously meant something to people that was away for 45 or 50 years, and that then could be rebuilt without having, I think, a deeper meaning, except that it should be there. And why was it taken away in the first place, right? I don't think it was like about, you know, German heroism or anything like that people have put it up. But so you get all these iron crosses again. And I think that's a very interesting phenomenon, because you had it side by side with all these East German / Soviet street names. And then I think, you know, when it comes to the debate in Nuremberg, I mean, it's all about, I think, whether, you know, some elites make a big thing out of it or not. You know, I go with my children to watch football games all the time in the Olympic Stadium in Berlin, and it's the most horrible Nazi architecture, of course. But nobody cares, right? Because it has been used since the 1940s, 50s again, although it has a horrible story, not only of the 1936 Olympics, but actually during the Battle of Berlin. They had like 20,000 Hitler youth in the middle of the stadium giving the oath to the Führer, and they were sent right to the Soviet front lines, and most of them died. So it was also a place where child soldiers were used, and it's a horrible place if you look at the history. And there's no memorial plaque for this or anything, right? People just watch football there. So I mean, I think it very much depends on the context. You know, you can have all this contextualization also in Berlin, all these debates, but then on the other hand, you have everybody going to football in, you know, a place that I think would need more explanation than it gets. I mean, there are some plates, obviously, which discuss the 1936 Olympics, and that Jews couldn't participate in all these things. But it's, you know, most people don't care about it. And I think this leaves us with a very ambivalent picture about Germany. I mean, who cares? Is it just the elites? But sometimes it's also the local people. But then they don't care that they live on the street of German-Soviet friendship, but they do care about their old war memorials. So, I mean, I'm myself a bit confused. I'm not quite sure what to make of it, but maybe the other people can.
Yeah, but also I think two important things were brought up, because first of all, you brought up Nuremberg, and actually this particular case was a case study on which Sharon MacDonald coined the term difficult heritage. So she was particularly looking at this example, and while thinking about it, she also referring to it, created this term and proposed the term difficult heritage, which I think is very telling that we are talking about it here. But also something that you brought up is, I think there are many layers of memory, and there is this vernacular, let's say, layer. What you said about the villages, what we also observe, I'm working a lot in Poland in the little villages, and I see that the processes that are happening are often completely disattached from the, let's say, national, official, state-organized memory, that there are some vernacular practices that people just conduct in their own, you know, like in their own community, because something means something for them. For example, because it was always there, or it used to be somewhere, right? And probably, for example, it marked the center of the village or something like that, and they need these points in space, or somehow they find their ways to actually bottom up, right? Create certain practices, memory practices. And I now would like to ask this question to Kateryna, but obviously coming back slightly to what Margaret was also saying, and you were also describing today during the seminar, practices related with memorials and other signs in public space. So could you also tell us a little bit about the context of Ukraine?
Yes, thank you for your questions. Situation in Ukraine now is very special, of course, you know, and the actual war Russia started against Ukraine. It's now a very important factor that will determine also interpreting of the Soviet heritage and also the heritage of the Second World War in Ukraine too. Because now, and it's guilt of Russia actually, that this image of the Soviet soldier, it was also ideologically, but in a historical and cultural memory, was always connected as liberator, as the big part and big actors in the liberation of Europe from the National Socialism, yes, and fascism as a big space. Then also connected in Russian actual ideology with the war against Ukraine. It also proclaimed like a war against Nazis or fascists in Ukraine. So it's constructed ideologically as a part, as a proceeding of the Great Patriotic War. Actually, it's from propaganda side, it's made probably not so stupid, because these are deeper archetypes. They are refreshed in the memory and the imagination of people. They think really they remembered from their childhood that they should hate fascists, and they were the big enemies, and it was enough to project these images to Ukraine, that they were ready to fight against the new Nazis in Ukraine. So it's already connected to this interpretation of the Second World War and of Soviet heritage, connected with an actual war in Ukraine. So it will be not now. It's in Ukraine. I guess it will be not only in Ukraine later, and it's already changed the whole picture of it. And when a Russian soldier is an aggressor, not only an actor of liberation now. So that actualizes also big and different parts of discussions. I won't start it, just about the memory space in Ukraine. I would say, of course, this war is a big factor of changing of this the space in progress now. And the people are reacting, actually, I mentioned in this seminar too, there is also actions or performances or just vandalizing from below, of course, because the people are really frustrated, and if they're of the behavior of Russia. And it can be explained, maybe it's not a very clever solution in a great historical perspective, but from the point of view of ordinary human, we can explain these emotional reactions to delete all the memories about also Russian culture, Russian presence in Ukrainian space. So if we cannot take Putin and bring it to court, or so responsible will be, of course, also Russian culture, Pushkin instead of Putin, of course, and it's emotional reaction now in Ukraine. And so it's a similar process with the heritage of the Second World War. Also, it's not so simple, of course. If we before spoke about decommunization in Ukraine, it was more slowly also officially regulated process. Slowly changing of also in naming in the public space, monument and so on, changing of it, taken away of Soviet monuments like Lenin and so on, as monuments for the soldiers from the Second World War were mostly untouched in this process. And now it's also an interesting phenomenon in Ukraine that some of these monuments are reinterpreted. They were, they are like Ukrainian soldiers, who were mobilized for the fight against Russia now. So it's also rethinking, given an additional senses through the monument, and this anti-decommunization process, and now, of course, received in Ukraine also a derussification moment, and it's unavoidable on the situation, and we are now. Probably it's also not very prepared or discussed in the process, of course, but it's very spontaneously vandalization actions, of course, but it's in some cases it's symmetric to the actions of Russia. And if we hear that the Russians, for example, last week destroyed the monument for their Holodomor victims in Mariupol and everywhere, if they came, they try to lose the Ukrainian historical and cultural memory in monuments, in school, and everything, in language, and so on. And they took out the monuments of Lenin from the museum, so somewhere, and bring them back. We understand that this deconstructive of the spaces, trying to influence it of course a part of this hybrid part of the war too, because it's monuments they make mark the spaces. Yeah, they try to reconstruct Soviet space, our common space, and so on, and bring Russian figures in it and take away and destroy Ukrainian memory about it. So we can avoid it, and it's a big and an important part of the war in the whole, of course, now. And we don't know how it can end, but we just can make say as a statement that it's a logical proceeding of the military situation.
Yeah, so what you describe is like monuments actually being weaponized in this, and I also think it's very relevant because, and also like we can't expect a structured or prepared response to an immediate situation as the war, but like coming back to Margaret, because you started also talking about how it looks like in Estonia, and also obviously it echoes the global events taking place, and especially war in Ukraine. But you also said something that I wanted to ask you now about, because you said that these monuments are being torn down or taken down, and then they are being like put in a museum or displayed as in a row of like tanks, as you said. But then like, so you as a museum person and as a curator, what would you expect to happen, or do you have any idea how these processes should be done in your opinion, so that it's just not being taken from public space and put somewhere else without, as I understood, any contextualization? So there is a very dramatic gesture of like taking something out from the public space, but then again the next day it's just being displayed somewhere else, right? So how do you see that, and what would you expect actually to be a better solution, if there is any?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and something I'd like to think further about. I also have to say that I've moved very recently, after 13 years of living in the Netherlands, back to Estonia in the end of the summer. So I'm also kind of still observing and trying to situate myself in relation to these local debates. And the country has changed immensely in the meanwhile. So yeah, I think it's unfortunate that they are kind of these objects are placed to museums without any preparation to allow the museums to think about it. But once things are that far, I think at least we should, well, in this particular case, concerning this tank monument from Russia, from the border of Russia, from Narva, it cannot be put on display the next day. It just needs some time. And after this tank was removed from its place, I should also add that Narva is a town with 95% of Russian-speaking people. It was just filled in a few days after with flowers, so it was a site of mourning and this loss. And I think I think somewhere we need to acknowledge that what people commemorate are different things in relation to some of these objects. How it could be brought to the museum, of course, text is the most obvious and the most simple, that yeah, you could include different voices when framing an object, and what these gather some of these meanings, what these meanings have been. But I think it could also go beyond that. And how exactly, I don't know. Yeah, maybe some video means, some means of like having an extra information, but this takes time, yeah. So giving it a few years, I think, is a good idea.
What you, Margaret, said provokes a conclusion that heritage, difficult heritage, is always kind of difficult because it is inclusive, not enough to like cover all the desires or wishes to commemorate. It's always someone's heritage, and it's really hard to like find this solution to make it like common. Like to shared heritage in these terms. But I would like to ask about the public debate about difficult heritage in case of Germany right now, how the public debate, also academic debate, looks like, and what is also, if there is any change since February 2022 regarding this concept of difficult heritage and ideas, how it should be treated, and what are solutions to make it not so controversial for some groups of the people. Maybe you, Jan Behrends, would.
Thank you. Well, I think, I personally was approached a couple of times by Ukrainians especially, but also other people from post-Soviet space who thought that, you know, something should be done about the Soviet monuments, especially in Berlin and in East Germany, which are of course very prevalent. But as most of you maybe know, they are also protected by the reunification treaty with Russia, with the Soviet Union rather. So, so we would actually be breaking international law by just taking them down, which I think we should leave to Russia to break international law, and we should sort of like stay within the law. So I'm not an advocate of that, but you know, I mean, of course you could say this needs to be contextualized, or why not further contextualize it, or you know, do something to them to break their often very, very strong presence in some spaces, if you think about Treptower Park and so on. But then I think it's maybe less about the material heritage than about, you know, what it means to people. And you know, in the 1990s, I remember that on the 9th of May, people would come to Treptower Park. I was living not too far away from it actually for a while, who were still of the older Soviet generation, and just lying flowers there and thinking about the war dead and the war and so on, which I always thought was a fine thing to do, and I had no problems with that. But in the last, I don't know, 10 years or so, I mean, this Putin cult of the war has really been exported to Germany. You know, you can book it in Moscow, like a tour to like Treptow, and then go there, and then you have shashlik and speeches and the aggressive anti-Ukrainian, anti-Baltic, whatever rhetoric. And quite frankly, I think that should be outlawed. I don't think we should have these sort of like pro-Putin demonstrations, and there's no room for that in Germany. So, you know, the difficult question that is posed then is, of course, how do we, I mean, there's also right for demonstrations, of course. How do we, how is the legal framework actually that our, you know, politics can outlaw things or not outlaw things, or regulate things at least, and you know, what do we want to do about it, or how do we want to counter also the spread of this very aggressive Russian war culture in Germany, because of course it is also popular in parts of the Russian-speaking population here, On the other hand, I don't think it had any impact on the wider German public, you know. The wider German public doesn't care much about Soviet war memorials. It is a little bit of a fragmentation, and I think, you know, generally, I think in Germany, that these spaces are very, very fragmented, and as I said, very, very regional, local, and you can find the weirdest things sometimes, and things that are completely devoid of meaning sometimes, you know, like in my hometown in Bremen, there's a big Bismarck statue, and it's just a place where people meet. You meet at the Bismarck, but I think many of the school kids who meet there, I don't even know who Bismarck was, you know. As far as they're concerned, it's just a guy on the horse, right? I mean, so we also shouldn't like overestimate it, but then there's also weird experiences. I mean, for example, I train German soldiers, officers who go to Lithuania, not Estonia, but Lithuania, but Baltic countries for NATO Enhanced Forward Presence. And this February, I also did this at the 1st Tank Division near Bielefeld. And already when I was invited to give the seminar, I was sort of curious because the barracks is called Field Marshal Rommel Barracks. And I remember that, you know, according to the official statute, you cannot have barracks named anymore after like Nazi generals or so on. This was like, you know, at some point in the 1990s, and they changed the names of very many things and ships and you know, whatever. So I came in, and then, you know, and it got even more weird. You know, you go into the officers' lounge, to the club, sort of like, where they have dinner and so on. And there's this huge oil portrait of Rommel with the Iron Cross and the Poulet Mérite and the Marschallstab, I don't even know what that is in English, and everything basically, sort of like this icon when you enter the room. And I asked the commander, the very nice, very educated colonel, I asked him, you know, do you think it's a bit out of hand, you know, with the sort of like Rommel cult that you have here? And what about the name? Why wasn't it changed in the 1990s? And about the name, he said, well, we wanted to change it because we had orders from Berlin, right? Orders, it's the army, right? But the town wouldn't want it. They wanted to keep it. And then the widow and the son of Rommel intervened, and that's how it died. Okay, fair enough. I said, but what about the Rommel on the, you know, the painting and all this stuff? And he was like, well, people like it. I mean, you know, we're a tank army, and he was a great tank general, so we need it for motivation or something like that, he said. You know, and actually that was something which I thought would not be possible in Germany at this point, and it is only possible because you have to go through 3 iron doors and show your passport, and you know, to get in. It's not really a public space, right? It's a enclosed army space, but there it is still possible to have something like that. But then on the other hand, I mean, the commander and all the people there, and I talked to many of the officers and so on during the training. Many of them are Russian Germans, have Turkish background, have all sorts of backgrounds. So I mean, they're not Nazis, right? And they don't see it as a Nazi thing. They see it as a military thing. This is not necessarily to excuse it. I think the Rommel should go, but it also to explain that, you know, these are not some sort of like neo-Nazi cult that they are having there. At least that was not my impression. But it shows you, you know, how I think how diverse things can be, you know, and how I think we have such fragmented spaces that we don't really, we can't really make general rules about, you know, this is how it is in the whole of Germany. And I think this is my last point. I think one of the most interesting places to observe these sort of things is actually border regions. And in the summer, I hike a lot, and I hiked once in the German-Czech border region, and it's very interesting how these Czechs who live in these border towns that used to be completely German until 1945-46, restore all these German cemeteries, churches with the German inscriptions and everything, which has become a big thing, not in the 1990s so much, but like in the last 10 years maybe. And you wonder why they do it, or even monuments to Kaiser Franz Josef or something like that, which is sort of like, you know, they never lived under Franz Josef. Why would they want to have that, right? I don't know. I mean, also, again, I think because they sort of think it's part of the place where they live now, but it's part of the heritage that they see, I guess, in some way positively, because otherwise they wouldn't be restoring it, right? Or even more interesting, in Alsace in France, I was in a little village, and they had, at the church, they had a war memorial, which obviously was brand new. They couldn't have it in the 1950s or 60s or so. It was like from the 90s or 2000s. With all the people who died from this little village, Kaisersberg, it's very beautiful, look it up, near Strasbourg. With all the people who died 1939 to 45, but every name had like a different reason given why they died. So you have the first couple of people where it says tombé pour la France, fallen for France, right? And then you have people that are like sort of like arrested and put into a concentration camp or fusillés or something like that. And then you have people, I don't remember the exact French inscription, but it says like pressed into the Wehrmacht and fallen in the east. And then they die in Kharkiv or Rostov-na-Donu or, you know, all these places. But I guess it took them 40 years to come up with a consensus on how to do this and how to put all these people who had very different fates. Some died in Dachau, some died in Stalingrad, but they were all from the same village, right? And to put them all on one thing in the church, on one plate. And I think this is where it becomes interesting, where you see, you know, obviously this couldn't be commemorated for 40 or 50 years, and then at some point, you know, someone comes up with a compromise. And I think these are probably the most interesting things also to talk about, because I think that's where memory actually becomes sometimes much more contested on the local level than in these big intellectual debates.
Yeah, and I think it's also, I just want to refer very quickly to two things. So I think in some cases, as with Franz Josef, there is also nostalgia coming into play, right? And like, obviously, if something is distant enough, you know, we can just make anything out of it, right? So like, this is also a creative approach to memory and commemorations. So I think that's one factor. And another factor that you've mentioned is the long process of negotiating that sometimes has to happen for something to finally be commemorated in words or in a material form, which I think is very important, because we also observe that in Poland, for example, that only now certain places or certain sites related with the Second World War are being eventually commemorated, because, you know, the generational change and the long years of debating, like long years after 1989, obviously the debate was possible on a different terms. So the long years of debating actually bear fruits only now. So I think that's also an important factor. So time, but you wanted also to refer to something that was said.
There is so many interesting topics. Well, I just wanted to add, if it's about Rommel, yeah, this I wanted to add, it can be also a certain nostalgia, and also a certain nostalgia in some parts of the German society. And I think if there would be a decision from a general to remove the picture or painting of Rommel, it's I think it shows very well that not everything is talked through, not that we still have this nostalgia in German society. So this I just wanted to add. And the funny thing with Rommel, and this is connected with my hometown now, Stuttgart, the airport is Manfred Rommel Airport. It's Rommel Airport. So you can imagine that when I first landed there and I saw Rommel, I was quite shocked. Of course, later I found out that it's the mayor. But I also thought, how can you name like an airport Rommel Airport? Yeah. It's the sun, exactly. So it's very interesting. So very interesting topics came out of like your comment. And I had the same summary. I also think that the beginning of the war, or the start of the full-scale invasion of Russia to Ukraine on 24th of February didn't really provoke a profound intellectual debate about our contested heritage. It's more discussed within the diaspora from Ukraine, or as you mentioned, it's used in a very symbolic way by the Russian-speaking or German Russians or Russian population here in Germany. So it's not a debate which is now going on. So this would be also my summary. And if it's about occupation or using these monuments or buildings in a symbolic way, I unfortunately did not participate in that, but as far as I know today at 12, there was like an annexation of the Russian Cultural Institute. Oh, you were there, but this was organized. Oh, you voted for annexation, yeah. So it's interesting, yeah. So it's of course organized mainly by the Ukrainians being active now in Berlin. So it's also something very symbolic, perhaps not a monument, but an institution or an organization.
I have a question. How do you, in your everyday professional practice, as a part of IFA, Institut für Auslandsbeziehungen, but also member or active person in many other organizations, how you deal with this concept, if you deal at all, if you have to deal at all with this concept of difficult heritage? I'm not talking about the Soviet monuments or this kind of objects, but you mentioned at the beginning Nuremberg as this example for difficult heritage in the context of Germany. So I'm just wondering, what are your experiences from your professional life in this case?
Yeah, the IFA, the Institute for Foreign Cultural Relations, is an intermediary organization for the Foreign Office of Germany. So we work within the foreign cultural policy of the Federal Republic of Germany, and mostly all the projects are abroad. I'm responsible for the dialogue with Central and Eastern Europe, before also Russia, Ukraine, Central Asia. But we also have different departments. One very well known is the art department, and here this topic is very important. So just to bring one example from this year, so it's the Venice Biennale. Perhaps you've been there or you read about the German pavilion. It's a very special concept this year. It mainly deals with the past. It's the curator is Maria Eichhorn. And it was about deconstructing the pavilion as a Nazi architecture building. So no one knew exactly how what she will do, but in fact it's remained empty, and the curator was working a lot in the archives, and she did quite a tremendous research. So it was more about the catalog and the whole event as such. So this would be something how we deal, or one example. So it's definitely the topic of this year's biennial, and the IFA is the organizing the German pavilion. But of course, then in my work, I deal a lot with organizations in Central and Eastern Europe, and so we do a lot of we have a lot of projects, binational, international, also on topics of memory, of culture, and then there I think the important part is that you really open up for the dialogue, you open up for the other perspective. And I think the most important or interesting case also right now is Germany and Poland.
I also wanted to come back to something that was sort of like floating in the room, the question of like how to, because we've discussed a little bit that we are still dealing with dissonant or contested heritage or difficult heritage from the period of the Second World War, and the Venice Pavilion is an example of how to deal with material objects like that. But at the same time, we can say, to simplify, we have another difficult heritage in the making, right, in Europe nowadays. And you were describing, Margaret and Kateryna, the examples of like immediate responses to some of the material objects, some material heritage objects. And I wonder now, and it's a question to you, Kateryna, again, what
do you think there is a potential in, but because you described some interventions, performances, different ways of like people actually using certain material heritage as something they openly contest, or they perform different gestures towards it. And we know there is a lot of like documentation work happening now in Ukraine. And by the way, the Lviv Center for Urban History, and Sofia Diak is here with us, is doing amazing work of like collecting stories. But do you think there is also a potential in documenting such events or such actions or such gestures, as you mentioned, and how do you perceive that? Do you think there is a need for documenting that, and is that happening?
Yes, thank you for the question. Of course, maybe it's documentation. It's take place, of course, and probably is the first war. Hopefully, also the last one, probably. But the war, which is so deep presented in social media. So we can live or not live, just register it, just to see, to watch what happened in details. So it's thanks to modern technical possibilities, we can follow a lot of things, a lot of processes which are happened now. So maybe it's the only advantage if we dare to say it, that we can actually to investigate this war, some mechanism of it actually from inside, thanks to registration and documentation of very many things actually what is happening now. But it's not only enough, it will be really, very many things will be registered, documented, just take with video and audio and so on, followed with such confirmation of what happened. We can check it later. But it's not the one thing there, the solution, completely solution of the situation, because as we see all the things, artifacts, facts and so on from the museums, it's not monuments and so on, and also cultural memory is not a completely prevention of this repeating of such things. So memory and commemoration and form of commemoration, it's really a life process, as we can see, and it can be instrumentalized and it can be used or misused. Now by Russia, you had as this example, there's this monument in Treptower Park. It was first understood as commemoration place for the memory on the Second World War. But it was more and more used for Putin's propaganda, just for instrumentalization of these performances, of this Победобесие. I don't know who knows, but Russian, you understand this term. Just really is a crazy public religion, then with its rituals and so on, and trying to play the heroes themselves and their clothes and so on. So the only monument, even, okay, in the Treptower Park, it's not a very good example, but because it's very beginning, very Soviet and very totalitarian origin, but the things on the monument, they can be instrumentalized, they can be resynced, they can be misused actually. And if we think about the museum, it's a very good example actually with Nuremberg and this documentary census center of Reichsparteitag, for example, and difference between modern and old style museums, for example. When I remember under their most war museums, Second World War museums, or Great Patriotic Wars they were called, and still are called in Russia. In Ukraine, it's long ago, it was already renamed in the Museum for the History of the Second World War in Ukraine. So if we think on these museums, they are full of different things So if we speak about documentalization and registration of the events, there are many things in the museums which should provoke to hate, also to bring people to hating of fascists, so to provoke them to be angry against it and so on. But, for example, you can find this, such things like a glove from man's skin and so on, very original things. The people should be impressed of these crimes of the National Socialists and so on. But it was never discussed real reasons how the whole society was brought to this situation of influence and propaganda and so on. So it was, it's maybe not only documentalizing, it's important, but also this permanent process of rethinking, of discussion, of prevention of it all. You know, it's more, the modern museums or documental centers, they are more interactive. They are more involving the people to thinking with the organizers, to think it over. And to reflect the situation. And the old style Soviet museums, they are collected things, but they didn't propose this possibility to reflect on it. They just proposed mostly their setting and actually already ready answers on the difficult questions. So it's we should remember, I guess, that this rethinking of the memory or the possibility to instrumentalize or misuse the memory, the moment, it's always actual. We cannot prevent it once and forever. That is, for example, monument for heroes, and someone, the new discourse, for example, it can lead to the rethinking of the monuments too, of the past, or bring the new aspects to the discussion. I discussed with the students in the seminar this example with now anti-racist discourse on destroying or cancel culture and monuments for some big persons in politics or culture now in the USA and other countries, for example, that the people who considered to be the very long time the great persons for the history for those countries, with a new discourse, anti-racistic discourse as supposed to be racist, they were cleansed, they were cancelled from this cultural memory. So we always should remember, I don't want to say now that it's also very, very good and absolute solution, so also good or universal solution for all these things, but it's a process, it's in progress. We in Ukraine feel it now very well that the memory, it's not once and forever formed statements or some points. It's a process of rethinking, and it's very important to maybe to keep this dialogue or to feel the danger. Maybe the people relaxed too much watching what happened in Russia with this victory cult and so on, and not registered, not managed. It's just very dangerous things, because they just followed and the forms which Nazis used sometimes. It was very similar, but we didn't take it seriously. So it's really process in progress, and we should watch and take care about the forms which they could take, and left this dialogue on the possibility of this dialogue open, I guess.
Yeah, I think you raised a very important issue, because on the one hand, and I think it was mentioned by many of you, we need time for certain processes of negotiating meanings and so on. We need the process to happen. And as you said with the example of the tank, we need process to actually find good ways to actually put something in public again, or we need time to actually be in dialogue, because we might have different opinion, or there might be different voices around something. But at the same time, there's always this risk, and that's how I hear what you said, that we have to remember that each and every action like that can be actually instrumentalized or used, basically, because as soon as memory is being institutionalized, certain things are obviously always adjusted to the contemporary needs of whoever is in charge of how memory or memory culture look like. So I think that's very important. And I'm looking at Małgosia if she wants to ask a question, because we want to also open the floor to the rest of the people in the room. So
I just want to propose that.
Yeah.
So it's totally fine. But before we open the floor for the questions, maybe one short question to each of you. Because since we were talking mostly about the monuments that already exist since a few decades at least, and if we would skip to the present time and would think about commemorating today, about the monument culture today, or the monuments today, do we today need any other monuments? What do you think? I'm referring, because not in all countries, of course, it is a case, but in some of the countries it is still a case that monuments are still present in the public space, like they are new and they are also today built. So that's the question, if we need any monuments also today. I will start with my right.
Well, I mean, I think it's quite obvious that at least in the West, maybe not so much in parts of Eastern Europe or the post-Soviet space, there's sort of like a crisis of heroic representation, right? We don't put guys on horses anymore and put them in the middle of a public square, mostly, I think, in Western democracies. You know, that's part of the post-heroic society, or whatever you want to call it. You know, there's no monuments for victims, not for heroes mostly. I mean, if you look at Berlin, you can also problematize that, of course. I mean, you know, you have this thing now in Berlin, of course, after the Holocaust monument was built, and then there was one for the homosexuals and for the Roma and Sinti, and I'm not sure if we already have more, that, you know, all sorts of nations, of course, now appeal, but then we also want a monument. What about the Poles, Ukrainians, Serbs, whatever. Of course, you could name many groups. And I'm also not sure that's a good idea to keep adding and adding and adding and adding and adding. Like in the old days, in the 19th century, we were adding heroes and heroes and heroes and heroes. Now we seem to be adding victims and victims and victims and victims and victims. Yeah, can do that, but I think, you know, it creates new problems and hierarchies also of victimhood, of course. You know, who gets the bigger monument, and you know, and why is mine close to the Reichstag and mine is far away somewhere in the woods, and you know, all these sorts of things that you had in the old days too. So. And it also leads to funny things. I don't know how many of you know that there will be this monument for German reunification in front of the fake castle that we rebuilt. That would be another thing that we could talk about. This rebuilding boom, and you know what they did in Poland in the 1950s, we do now. We rebuild things that were destroyed in the war. After a long time, we took the Polish example, almost 80 years on. While in the 1950s, we built ugly modern buildings. If you ever went to Cologne, then you know what I'm talking about. Well, anyhow, you know, I mean, this monument in front of the fake rebuilt castle will be a Wippe. What's that in English, actually? What children use to...
Okay, I know the Polish word, but I don't know the English word.
I don't know the English word either. Well, it doesn't really matter. Well, it is like a toy, and I think it's like the infantilization of 1989. I hate that monument. I signed a couple of petitions not to build it in this horrible and stupid way, and it also is a wrong metaphor because it's supposed to show that when all people move to the one side, then it leans over to the right side, and that sort of like majority. And I think that's wrong. That's not how democracy should work. It's not about that where there are the most people that they usually can decide anything. But democracy, of course, works within the framework of the law. So it has all sort of like completely wrong implications. Although it is trying to be nice and non-heroic, and it didn't put anyone on a big pedestal, and there's no guy on a horse or so on. But I don't think it works either. So that's what I mean, I think, by this crisis of representation. And I'm not sure if there's any way out of this sort of like in the postmodern world. It's more interesting to talk about the differences between our societies. And I mean, of course, this is one thing that you could see in Germany during the war now, that we do have great problems, of course, in this society to understand, for example, the heroism of the Ukrainians. The decorating of soldiers, of falling heroes, the admiration for the people who serve on the front and so on. These are ideas that are so discredited in Germany that I think there are some people who will not really take the Ukrainian side because they don't like it. They think it's militarism or something like that, right? There's a big difference between this post-heroic Germany and the you're also forced to be heroic Ukraine defending itself. And I think this also leads to many cultural misunderstandings. I always try to explain people that no, Ukrainians are not crazy militarists. They're just defending their country, right? But for some, especially older generation, very pacifist Germans, they don't like it what they see. They don't like Zelensky in the NATO in the green shirt and all this stuff. And also some people who are like more into critical theory, they already see Zelensky as the biggest example of toxic masculinity, or whatever that is. Not Putin, but Zelensky, and this all raises, I think, many questions about, how can we represent history? What is the way to go in the future? And also in Polish-German relations, I think this is a big question. And the last thing that I want to say, which makes this, I think, even more complicated, is that in the official political discourse, we still think so much in these national communities. And our politicians think like that. Poles, Germans, French, Italians, whatever. But we had a big discussion already in 2014 at the Historikertag in Göttingen, a panel on how this doesn't work anymore and will work less and less and less. For example, in my son's class, 50% of the people have non-German background, right? So they're supposed to pay now reparations to Poland? Their parents are not gonna like that, right? They're Syrian or Russian or Ukrainian or whatever parents. And they're supposed to commemorate the Holocaust. Why? I mean, it wasn't their grandparents who did it, because it was a crime against humanity maybe, but you have to change the whole discourse. Also the whole discourse on Germans as perpetrators. It doesn't work with these kids because they've moved here in the last 30 or 50 years. They come from different communities, and you have to offer them something on top of German war guilt in order to identify positively with this country and become part of this society. It's not all that we can offer them. It's not just redemption for National Socialism. National Socialism for their families is like 80, 90 years ago, and they don't want to have anything to do with it, but they also don't want to take responsibility for it. Because it's not part of their past. And I think, as migration changes societies, this is something that is under-reflected in memory cultures, because memory culture is still so national as if we lived in the 19th century. And even there, we know that it was not true. There were lots of, mixed Polish, German, Silesia, whatever, things where you couldn't really make that difference so easily. Even there, it was a lie. And to continue, I think, these very national cultures of memory, I think, is highly problematic. But on the other hand, we have to admit that's the way it still is in Europe, right? That's the way it's organized.
Yeah, I also want to say that protesting monuments is also something that we often do in Poland. So maybe this is the reason why we need at least initiatives to build monuments so that we can protest them, sort of like to voice our positions against something, because there is a lot of protesting like around many monuments and ideas for monuments as well. But also like referring to your second point, I think there is this question of like whose legacy is something, and then like whether that can be something more than a national community, and maybe we could think of in terms of heritage communities, right? And there was this term introduced by the Faro Convention, which might not be ideal, but that maybe can give us some directions that maybe we should be more open to various people feeling that they inherit something, right? So that they belong to a certain memory culture, although they are not Poles, but somebody else, but they can sort of like access this particular memory culture. And I think this is a very interesting question, how that could happen while we still have nation states that sort of like govern memory cultures officially and fund institutions that are responsible for that. But maybe each one of you, do you want to also refer to the question about monuments?
I start with another thought, because on one way, well, we live in a post-heroic society in Germany, and perhaps it's also because we were lucky to live for the last 80 years in peace, and so we don't have these guys at the horse anymore. This can change also. But I was thinking about the reconstruction of Potsdam. I think it's a good example where perhaps you're not building a new monument with commemorating a former general, but you're rebuilding Potsdam in many ways, like to bringing this Prussian the Prussian city back, and it's very popular, like all this the architecture style, and of course it's forgotten that the Prussian state was also very like the militarism and the whole organization of the Prussian state and where it led. So the architecture is not always representing a very good time for Germany. So not only the monuments, but also this hype in the living in this baroque facades representing another time of German history. And about the monument, no, I would not build a new monument. I think right now it's too controversial, not up to date. I know that, of course, there is because we are here in the Pilecki-Institut. I know about the memorial for the Poles, and yes, it is important. But if it's about a new monument, I would not spend more money for that.
Well, I'm kind of also thinking still about this previous discussion. I think we need more monuments because we have things that need to be commemorated and remembered, and we are going to need those. This is going to stay like this, but maybe they just don't need to be from bronze and like so eternal, but more like ephemeral and either vanishing or something, more subtle in terms of gestures. And I remember also Nikita Godan was yesterday speaking about his ideas around movement, and so yeah, I think I'm very much in the line with this thinking, but also in relation to this Soviet monument. Still, I was reminded about my earlier museum visit today, or an exhibition visit, in an exhibition called Post-Ukraine. And unfortunately, I don't know the name of the artist, and it wasn't marked in space, but there was a beautiful orden that somebody had made with signs of for genocide. So an orden for genocide or orden for marodeurism. So that could be a very interesting combination of, rather than taking a monument down, to mark such, roles of people in visible and present ways. And sometimes it can be done through gestures. Yeah.
So about the monument, if you need a new one, I would say the Eastern Europe and in Ukraine in particular, it's much more actively changed space in this case. Of course, and it concerns not only their future monuments for the war now taking place. Of course, it's normal and not avoidable that events of now happening now will be remembered. Of course, in some case, and maybe two ways most popular by construction of monuments is heroic monuments for heroic doings, of course, and as places to memory for the big tragedies. It's also very important thing, of course. And not only this, it's the rethinking, restructuring of this cultural space took place for several years. This decommunization process, taking away this thousands of Lenin monuments, figures, and so on. So it's also a part of this process of reconstructive of the space, or a search for a national identity, unity, and common cultural figures, and not only who could replace that Soviet monuments, which no more actual, no more interesting for the most people, and which were also brought also to very absurd situation where in every little village there were a Lenin street and Lenin monument and so on. It was just too much. It's lost its meaning long ago. Also in Soviet time, it has no. It became also very formal situation. Of course, it's nothing to do with real commemoration or respect to Lenin or his ideas. So of course it's more moving an alive space of creating a few monuments. That's why in compared to Germany, where the most monuments were not destroyed or replaced, they just would the there are a lot of very different monuments from different times. Sometimes it's like a patchwork picture, yeah, or some things where different monuments coexist in Eastern Europe and Ukraine. It's more radically a process, as a taking place process when the with replaces really of the monument which are no more actual and creating a new. And to Zelensky, for example, as macho or toxic masculinity, it's just a unwillingness of a lot of Germans to take context into consideration. He was not before the war broke. He had nothing to do with this image of toxic masculinity in quoted, of course. Just necessity, and it's nothing. It had nothing with demonstration and so on. It's just part of the reality in Ukraine, everyday reality. And it's a bit strange to hear it and such opinions, because the Ukraine just defending himself. We didn't plan to attack the neighbors or something like it. And that, I guess, it's just a bit historical complex of Germany as interpreting of war always as aggressive war and not as a protection. As for me, I was wondered once as I first see the monument for Deserteure in English it's deserters, yeah. In Germany, first I've seen by Berlin here in Bernau in Northern, and as far as I know there are such monuments in other places. In Potsdam I haven't seen, but I have heard about it. And I was really wondered because, yes, of course we all know that this deeds like escaping from war or refusing to follow their crime on orders, it's also a good tool and it's very positive, but of these deeds was a monument really. Yes, we can be thankful for lots of people who didn't took place on the killing of the other people. It's very good, of course, but it's another scale, another perspective of monuments, so to say. We are maybe it's also part of Soviet heritage, but or now Ukrainian reality. If we construct a monument, it's also should be really heroic, doing wars to be commemorized in a monument. But just escaping from war, it's not big enough, not big event enough to be remembered in a monument. Then I just thought that is the original point, the idea behind of it was the other one. If we take National Socialism as aggressive war is the original point, of course, then the deserters, they are almost heroes, not complete, of course, but they are on this background. They are, of course, the much bigger figures. And when we take the situation vice versa completely in Ukraine, deserters, they would be blamed as a people who don't want or are not ready to defend his countries. It absolutely the other connotation and other explanations. That's why it wondered me. And so on this systems or these dimensions is, of course, when the deserters are heroes, then is Zelensky too much as toxic masculinity. But to compare to it, this I guess to refusing to understand that it's necessary to protect its own country. It's also like if toxic masculinity is another opposite position is like a self-castration. Sorry, it's maybe it sounds a bit strange, but it's also very difficult to imagine. We also always should take into consideration the context and the actual situation. Thank you.
Yeah, the context and perspectives, right, that are very important in all that. We promised to open up the space for questions, so I wanted to now check if there are any questions in the room. And please raise your hand, and we will come with the microphone. Yeah, I see you. Okay.
Yes, thank you. It's maybe not exactly a question, but it's sort of my comment based on what mostly Professor Behrends said about the sort of both the dissonant heritage and how to work with it, and also on the terms of national versus sort of like local heritage and how it reflects on the memorials or some sort of ways of commemorating the heroism or something. In the Upper Silesia region, so that's on the border of Poland and Germany, that was previous German, there's this small rural area, it's called Ostropa, and they have this very small, modest monument that was firstly, it was commemoration of the men from Ostropa who died during the First World War, where obviously they served in the German/Prussian army. And in 1945, when the area was taken over by the Soviet army, the people who lived in Ostropa, they destroyed the monument, not because they didn't want to celebrate the people who died back then, but they were afraid that they would be persecuted for the family members who fought in the First World War. And obviously, during communist times, nothing was done with it. And in, I think, late 90s, the local community decided to rebuild the monument. And since there were many Polish patriots in Ostropa during the Second World War who wanted to be in Poland, but obviously that was impossible and so on. So they made like a memorial that was both for the German soldiers that were from Ostropa and also the Ostropians that fought on the side of Polish army during the Second World War. And it was just for local heroes, and they were obviously mentioned where they were, who they fought for, so that's like very, there's no doubt that they were on other sort of sides of the political spectrum, right? But I feel like this is very important, the sort of tenderness and the sensitivity that the local community has towards the people who they try to commemorate, right? So they sort of, in this very small memorial, there's no doubt that they sort of managed to sort of connect this dissonant heritage, and no one sees this as, maybe chaotic or whatever. It's like a very special monument that plays a huge role in the local society, a local community, and I feel like when you execute it locally with this tenderness, it's more, it will prevail more than like a state sort of memorial or whatever commemoration, which always is can be involved in some political traction or whatever. So this is sort of what I want to add. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm just looking at the room if there's any other voice. Yeah, there's one voice at the front.
Thank you. Just a short question. A question some Germans ask. Why are there streets, squares, even schools, that's what I heard, named after Bandera? Well, the name Bandera, you must be familiar with this question. Is that part of this dissonant, of this difficult heritage? The name of Bandera. It's a question a lot of Germans ask.
Yes, it's a not simple question, and here we also deal with original position, which is still another in German in Ukraine. For big part of Ukrainians in Western Ukraine, Bandera, or more certain to formulate rather an image of Bandera, this created myth of Bandera's murder and hero. It's an important figure. It's became a symbol of liberation, of national liberation. If the Ukraine, it's still a lack of critical, not only Bandera himself, probably critical consideration of the integrative nationalism, the ideology. It's a question of the future, I guess, but it's still the difference, original point, what is behind of it. Bandera symbolized for all of people, first of all, the struggle against the Soviet regime, a bit less also a Nazi regime. It was a long ago and shorter story, but it's a symbol, and now it's actualized with in an actual war. partly true. It's just a symbol. Lots of people don't know lots of Bandera, like the other people didn't know a lot of Lenin, his certain biography, and so on. We are to do with the symbols. The reasons why Bandera became such symbols, like a flag of the struggle, is other big questions. But now the people who proclaim Bandera as a hero in Ukraine, you should understand they are not especially fascist or anti-Semitic and so on. They don't mean it. They just need a symbol, a symbolic figure who will be just used as a flag in this struggle. So it's a bit a simpler explanation, but it is so. It's not if they use or proclaim the symbol of Bandera, it doesn't mean that they support fascist ideology. They just understand, still understand Bandera as a symbol of national liberation from socialist, Soviet and communist regime. So it's if we use a simple answer that Bandera not so easy figure and so on. A lot of people just don't want to mention. But probably the actual war and actual consolidation of and the new heroes in this war in the future, probably they replace this leading figure, the symbols of liberation struggle, and it make it easier to interpret the past, also complicated past, and would be easier to deconstruct of this mirth of heroic image of Bandera too, we hope so.
I think, you know, for Bandera, because it always comes up when I'm talking about Ukraine in every discussion. I talk about, people ask about oligarchs, people ask about corruption, and about Bandera, as if this great country, beautiful country, would just consist of these three things. And I think for Bandera, I mean, if we talk about Bandera, and nobody here, I think on the panel would embrace any of his ideology, it also helps to put it into a European context. And we see that, you know, most European nations, and I mentioned Bismarck in my own talk today, most European nations have national heroes or whatever, you know, who are quite problematic, right? For example, Bismarck started 3 wars. We all know that, right? Okay, he united also Germany by fighting these 3 wars. But we still have in our streets and everywhere, and you could make a good argument that Bandera was a pretty marginal figure compared to Bismarck, actually. Or in France, you have Napoleon, right? I have to tell you about who Napoleon was and what he did. But he's still embraced, and and on the birthday of Napoleon, the French president goes to his grave and puts down the flowers and things like that. So I think, you know, it's also part of European culture, whether we like it or not, and we shouldn't like single out Ukraine, which I think happens all the time, for having this horrible Bandera, while everybody else just has like perfect national heroes from Pilsudski to Bismarck to wherever. That's just not the case, right? It's just, I mean, it is a very problematic figure, but I think, you know, these problematic figures all need to be talked about, and they're all parts of European history. And Bandera partially was also did what he did because the Nazis were there in Ukraine. And no, it was not Bandera who did the Holocaust, but it was the Germans actually who did it. And yes, Bandera's brother died in Auschwitz. And yes, Bandera sat in a German prison for 4 years. So I think you have to have a lot of context to understand where Bandera came from, as mostly an anti-Polish figure, sorry to say. And of course, an extreme nationalist. But also in the ideology that he had in his time, very typical of, you know, European extreme nationalism of the 20th century. Nothing especially monstrous, right? And this is my last point. I think it's especially monstrous to have a revival of the Stalin cult in Russia, which we have in the last 10 years, because Bandera was a very problematic figure, but Stalin was a monster. Mao was a monster, you know. But in Russia, you have a full-blown Stalin cult under Putin again, where children march behind pictures of Stalin. I think that's way more problematic, and that we should probably talk more about that than about Bandera, but that's just my personal opinion.
Are there any other questions? Let's see.
Hi, my name is Kaya. I wanted to ask about those more subtle ways to commemorate instead of material heritage. I mean, like, instead of monuments, what can be there in the space of the city to commemorate something instead of just building another monument? Because, as you said, maybe there are more of them than we already kind of need. I'm not an expert on architecture or anything like that. I was just curious what you're going to say towards this. Thank you.
Again, I cannot think of an artist name, but there is, for instance, an example of a disappearing monument that is kind of going underground gradually. Exactly, yes. So this would be one example. Then another example that comes to mind is actually not an artistic project at all, but in reference to what Jan was saying earlier about these border zones being interesting to observe. So again, in Narva, there is the only Lenin monument in Estonia, which is remaining, has been kind of put around the corner, kind of to to punish, like, for the naughtiness. So it's literally kind of around the corner in the Narva castle. So it's a subtle gesture, and you know the object still remains intact, but the space really does a whole lot of difference in there. And of course, I mean, there's other examples. Think of the monument underground nearby the new castle in Berlin with the books. So that's a beautiful gesture as well, which you really need to engage with in order to even notice it, and probably, you know about it so that you'd come there. But yeah, these are some things that come to mind. But I think also with movement, with music, sound, you can do really beautiful things. And yeah, there's, I'm sure, a new language emerging also, as long as these committees commissioning these monuments are not all that conservative, so there would be also space for such subtleties.
Maybe a little bit following that one is, what kind of formats allow, would make me think, to express what type of experiences? And you know, you kind of understand that monuments and museums have more spectrum, and that's actually something that I'm thinking about. I mean, we are living through the war. It's like living through what will become future heritage. You know, it's a kind of in the making. We will be telling and telling and telling. And something that actually right now, when I'm thinking also about lots of documentation projects, I'm thinking about Dissonant. I mean, how are they capable, and how we are capable of expressing dissonant experiences? Something, I think that there are some positive things, like, for example, in the way in Ukraine, there are less of activities are stigmatized as improper. So it's okay to leave the country and find a shelter. Not everybody has to go to the front. So there are different ways of saying that it's okay to live through the war in many individuals' ways. But you know, there's still a frame. And it's actually for me also something how this concept of that dissonant as something which will allow for society to heal later by being able to talk about these experiences, because I think especially they are not to be in the monumental form, and we hope. So that's one, I mean, comment, and maybe you could relate to that. Another one is about in the heritage. So heritage, a big powerful thing for heritage, or something being conceptualized as a heritage throughout the long life of heritage as a concept, is loss. When something is destroyed, it pushes to think about and transfer it to other. So in Ukraine right now, what is destroyed and documented as destruction is actually Russian imperial and Soviet heritage. Whether it's a library or a museum or local law museum or industrial building, you know, and that's actually my question would be how you see, I mean, it's a little bit like it's strange for a historian to ask about a futurist question, but this sense, you know, of loss, how can play into the understanding of heritage being, you know, brought to the question, to objects or stories which are imperial and Soviet. Yeah, and maybe like super one, like a monument question. Totalitarian, in your practice as a historians, curators, how this concept is helpful or rather problematic for you or not helpful? So that's, if you could reflect at the very end, that would be really interesting.
Who would like to start?
Yes, up to documentation projects and different models of behavior. You're right, there are a lot of Ukrainian refugees here, most, of course, absolutely most women with children and so on. They are outside Ukraine. There are a lot of projects who try to fix their experience. Not all of them are maybe very scientific projects, some just very fresh, prepared and so on. But what about this actual other experience of the people who are staying in Ukraine and who are fighting now, yeah, there are also different resources and possibilities to communicate to them or to fix their experience and so on. Also social media, and so we spoke about also documentation of fixation videos, audio and so on as fresh information. I guess we should also take into consideration the future is social medias and reflection of fresh information coming from Ukraine now in different sources. And about destroying the monuments, of course, lots are lost also from the Soviet and imperial heritage, so to say, but yeah, if you mean that is, so to say, it's not so big problem if it's some from a Soviet heritage is lost. It's not so, because it would be much better if the Soviet heritage would be restored or also reconstructed, deconstructed during a free discussions in a peaceful time. A lot of things are lost, of course, of very, very different nature, from industrial, cultural, and so on. Things sometimes it just we should remember. It's very important thing. It is just not lost. By the way, it's very special struggle of Russia against all Ukrainian culture, past and heritage. So it will be just, especially if you speak about libraries, if you speak about some important points for Ukrainians there, first of all are the aims of the Russian aggression, the Russian attacks. So if we speak about genocide, actually it's many times already used this term in this aggression against Ukraine, both in people and cultural heritage. It's very often in this very special ways to struggle against Ukrainian culture. And in the first lane it's really again the symbolical for Ukrainians, places or cultures, some cultural points and so on. And then some of things, places, buildings and so on are just destroyed in the course of war, not specially, but actually, and we should remember it's just very important part of Russian war against Ukraine to just to erase, to cancel Ukrainian culture and heritage too. It's actually it's never mind from which age it is, or sometimes curiously, as for a week, Kiev was attacked with drones. You know, some people were killed in the city center, and also Taras Shevchenko University was also partly destroyed. So it's not very strong, but some rooms were just also it's considered them true, of course. And one of the rooms in the Institute for Philology, it's a big building. One of the rooms is a former department of Russian philology. Actually, it sounds curiously, but it was renamed for some time and some kind of Slavic philology, I don't know. But the Russian didn't make no differ what do they destroy. Sometimes it's also things who could be earlier interpreted as a part of Russian world, so they are proclaimed it as all general cultural space and so on. But sometimes they destroy the things without any logic or accept of their attempts to bring Ukrainians more troubles and problems.
I think it's also quite telling that we've been living with this culture of heroization for such a long time. And there's something totalitarian in itself about it. So that this was the main, way of remembering and commemorating. And I think, especially because artists have been doing subversive things forever, that my own discipline, the discipline of art history, but also the social commission, has a lot to do with why this has been like that. I find this dissonant, difficult heritage very helpful for like starting to think how can we represent differences and bring them to the fore in our way of commemorating. And I think there's something to be said about storytelling and the cultures that don't erect monuments here, because I think storytelling does allow to take these differences of opinion so much better and stronger into account than, the Western heroization culture. So maybe we need to find ways to bring more storytelling to public space to actually create more awareness. Yeah.
Are there any other questions or comments from the public? I don't see any, so I think it is a time to close our today's event. Thank you very much for accepting the invitation and taking part in the discussion. Thank you for coming and being and listening to this discussion about difficult heritage. And thank you also, Aleksandra, for co-moderating. So have a nice evening. Bye.
Thank you.